so much for joining us. It's an amazing blessing to have you on our program. And you have years and years and years of accolades that precede you. And so we honor you on this channel as a legendary homicide detective. And we appreciate you being here. And I can't wait to dive into this subject with you. So thanks for being here.
Well, thanks for asking, Tyler. And I've, excuse me, I've always had a little issue with the legendary stuff. That was kind of a PR thing when I had my television show that they used to promote it. So I'm not sure I've quite reached that status, but I appreciate it.
Well, we're going to honor you like that, whether you want it to be honored that way or not. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this because I would imagine your history of investigating homicides again and again and again in Houston, which you and I have talked about, how some of those details sort of come in the last minute or come in from unsuspected places. I'm curious what you're thinking is behind this nab that they have. Obviously, Brian Koberger being arrested, and what you think evidentiary wise led them to be certain that he was the man.
Well, I have been commenting from the beginning on some other platforms about the need for patience.
Hmm.
That this scene was very complicated, it was multi layered, and the scope of the investigation that Moscow PD landed in, which was the lead agency in this investigation, very quickly realized that they needed more resources to
Hmm.
get involved in this processing the scene and continuing on with the investigation. So, wise decision at the beginning to bring in the state police and bring in the FBI. And by the way, I see a lot of comments about at the beginning about the chief being inept, incompetent, the
Hmm.
department inexperienced,
Yeah.
and they need to let the FBI take over, and so forth and so on. And I will just say this, that there were some communication problems at the beginning
Yeah.
in terms of the optics with the chief because he was, and I've said this before, that you're talking about a community here, a college community of about 28,000 people. That department has 36 sworn personnel and support personnel.
Yeah.
In the last 15 years, they've had 7 homicides.
Yeah.
They had 4 in one night.
Right.
And the magnitude of that particular scene, it was clear to me at the very first presser that the chief was just overwhelmed with what he had seen
Yeah.
and what he had realized had happened in his community. So as it progressed, I was when people would ask me to comment, I was always asking for patience,
Right.
that the people need to hold back and let the work be done. And but they continued with a lot of people continued with the criticisms of the chief, the department, so the investigation, so on and so on. I was confident.
It's hard from a perspective. I would just say, even from my own perspective, where we're not privy to what the processes look like from the inside of those departments. And
Correct.
something that I received some correction from you on, and you weren't even meaning it towards me, just when we had a phone conversation the other day, was I didn't understand what the dynamics of what it meant for something to be called a cold case was. A fear, I would just say, from my intention or hearts of even asking or posing the question, could this possibly become a cold case or not? It's sort of my intention was like, I felt, because I'm every single day keeping in tune with all of the news headlines about it, I felt that there was a release of some of especially the national media attention. And that had me nervous a little bit because it's like we need to continue to make sure that they're feeling a public pressure to get down to the bottom of this. But
Right.
you're like, this is the furthest thing I've ever seen from a cold case. And not only that, the thing that you said that stuck with me was it's very offensive in some ways or disheartening to a family for people to be speaking that publicly. And I didn't understand it from that perspective.
Yeah, and that was the negative people out there that were fomenting this attitude toward the chief and so forth and so on. That doesn't help the investigation.
Yeah.
And it certainly doesn't. It's to me, it is. It doesn't help the recovery of the victims' families
Yeah.
that this event that they'll never fully recover from. I don't know if we talked about it, but I never use the word closure. There is no such thing.
Right.
I know when I was involved in homicide for 23 years at Houston PD, that I would have families come up to me at the scene and I want closure. I want closure. And I would tell them then, you're never going to get that. The
Yeah.
place in your heart this loved one occupied, it will never be filled again.
Yeah.
There'll be a scar, but what I am going to promise you is that I'm going to do everything I can do to find the right person who's done the wrong thing and make sure that there is some justice served, and that will bring about some measure of peace for you.
Yeah.
And that's exactly the way I looked at this particular investigation. And what I'm leading up to is this. And I don't know many people recognized it, but the last press conference that the chief had, which was to announce the arrest of this person who I will not honor by saying his name in any way, shape, or form. That's just me personally.
Hmm.
Um, I I hope people would understand and recognize the incredible amount of grace
Hmm.
that chief showed at that press conference toward the very people that were calling for his head
Yeah.
not a week before.
Right.
He thanked the media. He thanked all those people that had called in tips, all the people that were supporting them. So I just thought that struck me.
Yeah.
I don't know if this chief is a Christ follower, but I can tell you
Hmm.
that he certainly reflected
Yeah.
the the type of grace that we're under Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Some of those values, it seemed like, was shining through, definitely. When you built out like a behavior analyst of the potential killer at the time, or you were building out maybe a profile of who you thought it was, how did sort of your thoughts or perceptions of the likely quadruple homicide killer was versus now the seeming reality of it being BK?
Well, I I can tell you that I wasn't big into profiling as the
Mhm.
word is commonly used. I wanted to do what I could do to get into the head of the suspect,
Mhm.
to try to have an understanding about who that person may be,
Yeah.
especially in a whodunit like this.
Yeah.
And my impression was of this scene, and this is just going on what I knew from the media and so forth and so on, what we were being told. I
Yeah.
knew the process that they were going through, but I've never gotten into the profiling aspect because when I entered an investigation, it was always to be objective, to not be predisposed to a conclusion, and to let the scene talk to me when I got there, and then take the evidence that I've been given and let that evidence lead me where I need to be, not take that evidence someplace I would want it to go. And so, and it's always a journey for the truth.
Mhm.
And it's not about what are we going to charge him with and this and that and this and that. That's left up for prosecutors, and when you convey that all the information you have, and that's what they did in this case, was to get the probable cause to get this arrest warrant for this guy. So
Yeah.
make no mistake about it, that affidavit, as much as it does contain a lot of information, I would be hard pressed to believe that it's got all the information, because the prosecutors are not going to reveal their entire case in a probable cause affidavit, because
Yeah.
the benchmarks for probable cause are much lower than to convict somebody beyond a reasonable doubt.
Allegedly, there was some DNA evidence that matched to Brian. I don't know if that's true. I haven't heard it from an official source. Have you heard anything like that?
I've heard that, and I've also heard that there was the use of genealogical DNA, which
Right.
I tell you what a wonderful tool for a homicide cop. Man, I
Yeah.
wish I'd have had that. I
Yeah.
wish I wish I'd have had that ability at the time, when I was working. But so I would, and I have said this from the beginning. Look, the process of the investigation and work on that scene is going. There's so much blood evidence,
Yeah.
and there's an edged weapon that's used. And in my experience, I have had scenes where an edged weapon was used, and it was used in a manner that was kind of haphazard, slashing, stabbing, and so forth and so on. And in those cases, the suspect has cut themselves in the process.
Right.
In one of those, as a matter of fact, he was wearing gloves. He's wearing plastic gloves. I've heard something to the effect that this suspect may have been wearing gloves as well. But the problem is when you're using that edged weapon, you're not really looking at the placement of your other hand. And so you tend to get that in front of where your target is. And in the cases that I worked, in one in particular where he was wearing plastic gloves, he sliced right through the web of his hand. And of course, it went right through the plastic glove and got to him. And once we got in there with the separation and look, these pieces of evidence that are going to be DNA is hopefully going to be extracted from. That just doesn't happen with a bunch of people running around swabbing.
Yeah.
They'll actually get the detectives, at least in my division in Houston. We would meet with the technicians that are actually going to process the DNA evidence, and we would discuss the piece of evidence we're looking at and what part of that evidence has the most probative value to it.
Yeah.
So it's not just we just start sticking swabs in pieces of evidence. So it's a very methodical mechanism that's used to extract the DNA. So once that's done, then they can, and they got a lot of DNA evidence in that house by virtue of the scene.
Hmm.
And so they were able to find out where that thing started,
Hmm.
where it traveled to, and then where it ended up.
Wow.
So you're going to be able to get the trail of the process of those murders. And what I have read is they have placed the suspect's DNA in areas of that scene that would be explained only by the fact that he was the one that
Yeah.
was there.
Yeah.
And so they again, and what they've done is what I have done on occasion, which is had a case, high profile case, where the DNA results needed to be ratcheted up
Yeah.
and returned in a in a quicker manner than what it normally is. A normal circumstances, um, at least at my agency, you're looking at 6 months to a year to get
Right.
DNA results back.
Right.
And now I have had them in 3 days. I'm just saying it can be done, and that's what was done in this case because of the urgency of getting to a suspect.
It's interesting to think that this is a young man who, described by his peers, especially from his hometown, as extremely intelligent, maybe even genius level intelligent, having some social quirks, possibly made fun of, at one point, a drug addict of a hard drug variety that I think is hard to come off of, at least from my research. And then on top of that, goes to Washington to be now not just a graduate level student, but a PhD student already with a master's degree and studying under some of the top experts of serial killers in the country. It's hard to imagine that he was just doing that out of an interest in the back of his mind, towards criminology or for a hopeful future, in criminal justice. To me, it almost feels like he was interested, maybe possibly, in killing from the beginning, and wanted to learn as much as he possibly could to create the perfect crime. How have you processed that information?
Well, I think that's when I would get a suspect, and of course my I always gave somebody an opportunity to speak to me. So I was always my ending in that realm of that investigation. Once we get a suspect in custody, is to get them in the interview room. And so you want to do what we would refer to as a psychological autopsy
Oh,
on
cool.
that
I didn't know
person,
that word. Yeah.
a psychological autopsy on that person. And you want to do your due diligence to be prepared for this interview. It isn't, you don't just rush in there and go, hey, we got you, let's talk about this. It just doesn't happen that way. You have to walk into that room and establish a relationship with them, at least the way I teach
Yeah.
interviewing. I mean, body language and eyes and all that stuff, that's all, verbal analysis and nonverbal analysis. That's all the same. Those are all, you may get different interview schools that use different terms, but um, in this guy's case, you would want, if I were the interviewer, he's not going to be interviewed, but if I were to interview a guy like this, and I would do this with anyone, is that you do that preparation, and you try to learn as much about them as you can, and all these things that you've talked about that's come out about this particular suspect is things that you would put into that formula because you want to know how to approach this person for the purpose of that interview. And so, what this is going to tell us is in the long run, I believe it's going to give us some background
Mm-hmm.
on why this guy got to why he went to where he went. Now, uh, he obviously, I mean, looking at his mugshot photo and so forth and so on, and I've had some people say, "Well, how can you tell by looking at his picture?" But look, there are some things and nuances that can be described at least by looking at that picture. And my first impression of him is that looked to me to be the face of someone who is arrogant.
Mm-hmm.
That okay, well you've caught me, but you're not going to convict me, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Because apparently he is highly, a highly intelligent person in those terms, but sometimes these folks end up outsmarting themselves.
Yeah.
So, as much as he may know about criminal justice or about criminology or about serial killers and that kind of thing, and he may have studied them for the purpose of seeing if he could get away
Mm-hmm.
this is not really what we'd call a serial killer, but this is a mass killing, um, and see if he could quote commit the perfect crime. Well, obviously, he did not succeed in creating a perfect crime because there's maybe
He
some
may.
things that
Yeah.
that he didn't do. If he wore gloves, thinking that he was covering that, but then he turned around and he
Yeah.
sliced himself. And you've got to remember too, I think early on there was a discussion that one of these young people may have some defensive wounds.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, then the first thing that's going to happen at that autopsy is they're going to scrape those fingernails
Yeah.
and see if they've got some sort of DNA evidence underneath the fingernails. So there are so many aspects of an investigation, especially one that is this massive,
Yeah.
that are looked into, and they are uh, processed. They are covered. They're processed, and then they came to the conclusions that all roads, at least at this point, and this is, by the way, I've heard some people talk about circumstantial stuff here. The DNA evidence is direct evidence. It's not
Mm-hmm.
circumstantial.
Right.
That is direct evidence
Yeah.
that he was in that room when this thing happened.
Yeah.
So um, that is very, very hard to refute.
Yeah.
And that's for him, that's the big question he's going to have to answer. And if he continues to deny it, well, I mean, the evidence is what the evidence is.
I read a report that said there were actually two of the individuals inside the house that had defensive wounds, and if that's the case, that's even
Right.
multiple, double the possibilities. I'm wondering if you think the killer was a psychopath.
That's a good question, Tyler. So let's distinguish, at least. I do it in the simplest of terms. So we've all heard the term sociopath, and we've heard the term psychopath,
Hmm.
and there is a fine line of difference, at
Yeah.
least in my understanding. And I'm not a psychologist, but I've dealt with these folks. And the sociopath is a person who will do something and feel justified in what they did.
Hmm.
Um, and that's kind of where it ends for them. Now, the psychopath is a person who will go out and commit a sociopathic act,
Hmm.
but he enjoys what he's doing.
I see.
So, in the case of a killing like this, a mass killing, I would be surprised if he does not have some psychopathic tendencies,
Yeah.
because I think not only did he perform a sociopathic act that he believed he was justified in doing for whatever reason, I think there was a probably a level of enjoyment that he took in committing the acts, and that would, uh, I think, and I kind of put that in with that goulash of what his
Yeah.
background was, and what his schooling, is, and then
Yeah.
his intellect and these kinds of things, and kind of I don't want to compare him to Ted Bundy, but a Ted Bundy type, where you have a guy that is above average intelligence at least, and is articulate, and but is calculating as well.
Yeah. It's interesting to hear the students that he was in class with at Washington State talk about the demeanor that he had, which was an elevated energy, sort of right after the killings. And then 2 weeks in, 3 weeks in, I guess before the semester was over, he was needing a lot of coffee and was drained and looked like he'd been staying up all night, which I think other profilers had said probably would be something that they would be looking at. Whoever this is probably paranoid right now, meticulously thinking about every single thing that they did and if they left any evidence behind. Another thing that was said about the students that were in class with him at Washington State was that whenever they had the conversation in the class, obviously it's a bunch of PhD students studying criminal justice. When they had that conversation, they said that he was totally silent about the Idaho murders. I think that that's fascinating to have a group of PhD students unpacking and dissecting what they think took place in this crime and the killers in the room.
Oh, I think that's amazing, but you know what? It doesn't surprise me because the animation that he was into, and kind of bouncing off the walls there at the beginning, and then he kind of goes downhill. Well, that's all about that's dopamine. That's that adrenaline rush.
Yeah.
And I mean, who knows? I have had cases where there was a kind of a strange sexual component to these types of things, and so we don't know what's going on in his head. But if that's the description of him, I can see where he's getting high. He's getting that high, much like he felt when he was addicted to heroin. If that
Yeah.
is in fact true,
Yeah.
so he's just found another narcotic to
Yep.
satisfy that need, and then in this then when he kind of, the edge comes off of it and he starts to drop down. Well, yeah, you've got to kind of get some things, because it's it's like that in the sense that once you have had that climax,
Hmm.
then your body starts to kind of trying to recover from that. So
Yeah.
everything slows down. You're
Sort of
sleepy,
dumping the adrenaline and then just
right?
the process that
And
happens
so the,
after
the discussion in the classroom, though, man, I'd have loved to have been
that. I
a
know.
fly on the wall when that took place.
I'd love to be a fly on the wall when the students realized that their co-student was
Yeah,
responsible for it, and they were sitting there having the conversations with him in
right.
their room.
Well, the thing about it is, I think if they said he was very quiet throughout, my sense there is that he was basking in the discussion.
Mhm.
And why would he say something that he, in his mind, I'm sure, would think that it might incriminate him? If
Yeah.
he gave a detail that maybe hasn't been put out there yet. Even if he was talking about in a theoretical way,
Yeah.
it might draw attention to him, and he's not going to do that. So he sits there and he just listens to the discussion, and he's relishing the attention and so forth and so on. I have no doubt that he was in front of a computer screen, a monitor somewhere, watching the numerous podcasts and television broadcasts. And I mean, he's been the guy for 7 8 weeks,
Hmm.
and I'm sure there's going to be some amount of fulfillment for him. And if and I would think that he was a little bit shocked when the SWAT team came to the door and said,
Yeah.
"You're coming with us."
Yeah, I think and it was like 3 in the morning when they did that raid. Now, the thing about his weight loss is proven. I mean, there were pictures of him where he was pretty large, 350, maybe even bigger than that
Yeah.
in weight. And then obviously in all of the photos and everything we see now, he's very, very skinny. So I don't know if he did hardcore dieting or if he was on drugs, but several people have came out and said that he was pretty open about his drug habit and the journey that he went on to sobriety with that. And so it's interesting. Scooby Life uh, sent a questionnaire. Was it Scooby Life? Somebody sent a question and was saying it was Deb. Could he have got addicted to crime like he did with drugs? And I think that's something that you were alluding to. Like,
Well, it
Scooby,
could be like I said. I mean, he's replaced one rush with another one.
that's exactly right. Now, Scooby Life sends a question in and is just wondering about the neighbor's dog. Do you think that the neighbor's dog, who was completely skinned, was possibly this killer, or how did you think through that whole aspect of the case?
I don't know. I know there were. I wouldn't even begin to speculate on that. Um, there was also a case where I think a week prior or something like that, or 2 weeks prior, they had the incident with the man who was going to stab himself, was going to kill himself, and he had beaten up his wife and so on and so on. So the problem is with a case like this is that now you get folks that start finding these events that on the surface may appear to be have some sort of similarity to it, but in reality have no connection whatsoever. So I'm not one of those that's going to, unless I see something the detectives have developed, of course,
Yeah.
I'm not one to speculate about other stuff that goes on around because, again, I always enter these things objectively and I follow the evidence. And I've only been able to follow the evidence in this as it's been what I know is being processed in the scene. And so everything that is culminated, that's got the guy in custody now, is has affirmed for me that they were doing their due diligence and they were
Yeah.
doing exactly what homicide cops, special agents, and state troopers should be involved with, and state detectives, and got them to where they got to.
The New York Post was reporting about a brewery that the killer was a frequent customer of. I don't know if you saw that report. He was going in and would be fine until he was 2 or 3 drinks in, and it was this was a repeated offense. He was hitting on people, and then when they weren't reciprocating it, he would get really, really dicey, calling them cuss words, kind of getting handsy a little bit. So much so that the brewery actually, because in order to go in, you have to be of age. They're scanning your IDs. They're keeping track of all of their customers. They
Right,
flagged him in their system with red
right,
flags saying that this guy, we got it. We have nothing we can call the law on really with him. It's just he seems to get close to the line of offense every time. So we're going to mark it in our system. After 2 beers, he starts acting crazy. I
right.
think that that kind of stuff is coming out in droves, and I think we're going to hear more and more and more sort of that evidence.
Oh, I think you're good. I agree with you, Tyler. I think we're going to, as this thing unfolds, and we see the move toward the prosecution, toward the trial, and the things that are going to be revealed there. It's going to be very interesting. I don't think he's going to be in the grander sense. He's not going to be anything particularly special. I wouldn't even give him that category. I think that the things that have happened to him in his life, if you want to use the, he was a fat boy and then he got ridiculed and then he, couldn't get a date and then he lost weight and he a heroin addict and all these other things he's obviously had a troubled life. I don't
Hmm.
think there's any any question to that. But and I can tell you that when they get to the prosecution of this thing, all of those things are going to be brought forth, and they're going to be used because we have to remember he's innocent until proven guilty.
Right.
That's the system. That's the way it works, and um, those things are going to be used in his defense. I am sure.
Yeah.
And because I know in Texas, there's and Idaho's a death penalty state.
Hmm.
And if they do choose to go with the death penalty, I know in Texas there are two factors which the jury has to consider when they're considering the death penalty. One is this crime of is this defendant is going to be a repetitive offender, and is there any mitigation behind this?
Hmm.
And in the cases that I've been in trial on, those types of factors, background, environmental factors, and influences as they're growing up and in their life and so forth and so on, have always been used to show some kind of mitigation.
Yeah.
So just because a person, and I can tell you that I've never had one that it's worked.
Right.
So I can just tell you that because of those things that he had, he might even come up with. I'm sure there are psychologists out there, psychiatrists that would make their uh, uh, diagnosis of him
Right.
that he had all these things, and he may even be suffering from a mental illness of some kind. He's obviously a narcissist.
Hmm.
He may be bipolar. You've got all those things, those mental illness factors that may be here, but it does not remove him from responsibility of what he did.
A common question is, did BK kill before?
That's an interesting question. And I have some of my colleagues that I've been on some of the platforms with think that he may have. I am not one that tries to predict things. I'm not. Again, I let evidence lead me where I need to be. So I'm not given to. I'm not saying these others are wrong for doing it. I'm just saying I am not given to a lot of speculation about things in regards to that. There's certainly look. We don't know um, if he's kind of I think the cookie cutout uh, of a serial killer or a mass killer is that they started out killing animals, and stuff like that. We don't know that, and I'm not going to guess in that. He may have been. This may have been a psychosis within him built up over years,
Hmm.
and what I'm interested in is what is his relationship with these four young people,
That is interesting.
because there is some kind of relationship there.
Yeah.
They weren't just arbitrarily picked out. So
Yeah.
that is going to be of interest to me as to what that relationship was, and whatever his larger problem was,
Yeah.
something occurred that manifested itself into this mass killing.
I saw that he was a vegan, so much so that he asked his parents to get rid of any pans in their house that had ever had meat on it. So I think that that was an interesting clue piece. But if you Googled top vegan restaurants in Moscow, Idaho, the number one option would be Mad Greek, where two of the victims worked at. And so who knows? I mean, I don't know if he was eating there, but there's potential there. They're going to the brewery. I would imagine he's probably been to the Corner Club as well. We don't know that for sure, but that would be a guess of mine. So
Right.
somewhere along the way, there was some hobnobbing, some running into that kind of a thing. I would think, and maybe it's from the restaurant, maybe it's from the Corner Club, maybe it's multiple things, maybe it's online stuff. I think Kaylee Gonzalez's dad was actually hinting that there is a history of some sort of a connection between them, and he can't come out and say it yet. And I'm like, okay, oh well.
Right. Well, it could be something. I mean, look, Washington State University is in where in Pullman, Washington, I think is the name of the town, and
Yeah,
it's what a 15-minute drive
yeah,
to the
less,
University of
less,
Idaho.
I think. Yeah,
Right. So I would there's no doubt that there's interaction between those student bodies, and there may be there's some kind of a nexus between him and one of these four people. I gotta believe, just from the way the killings took place, and now what we know about him being that proximity, being in that area. And you may be right. I mean, it may be something as simple as he went to this vegan restaurant where a couple of them worked and had some sort of a
weird.
altercation. He
Yeah,
was flirting, got rejected. I mean, there's something going on here that caused him to do this to these people. I'm even of the opinion that, and this is just based on what I know, that the Ethan and Xana were on the second floor, and Madison and Kaylee were on the third floor, and Xana and Ethan had come from the Sigma Chi house, and Kaylee and Madison had come up in an Uber driver with an Uber driver. So they're not even in the same places
that's
on
right.
that night. And so one has to wonder, and he went, the what looks to me to be that structure is the place that you would enter would be the second floor entry.
Yeah,
They've got the door on the third floor, on the bottom floor, but it appears that the main entry point is that second floor.
right.
So if he went in there, went to that first bedroom where he found Ethan and Xana in it, and started to do what he did, and then realized that this is not the person I was looking for. Now he's got to go find him. And so he went up to the third floor rather than going into the first floor. So he goes up to the third floor, and then he does what he does to Kaylee and Madison. So um, I it may be usually in big cases like this, it usually comes down to the KISS principle, keep it simple, stupid. I mean,
Right.
usually
Yeah.
that's what it is. All these conspiracy theories fall away, and it may be something as simple as what you just suggested, that he was eating in this restaurant and had some sort of something that offended him between one of these two people. So
I want to show you the most recent headline in this case. It's a little graphic, forewarning, but it's a fact of what's going on, and I'd love to catch your reaction. This is apparently what's going on. He's saying to the guards, "You come in here and I'll cut you." The accused Idaho murderer, Brian Koberger, taunts guards, exposes himself, and sings violent rap lyrics as he sits in jail awaiting extradition over the deaths of the Idaho students.
well, we've all acknowledged at least on an intellectual level, he's a smart guy. And on a more organic level, he may be a smart guy as well, and he is trying to set himself up for some sort of insanity defense. That would be my take on that. And I'm not saying that's what he's doing, but
Yeah.
when people start to act out, like the killer, the guy that just was recently convicted for driving his truck into the Christmas parade, uh,
Oh, yeah. Daryl Brooks.
he
Yeah.
spent a lot of time uh, trying to convince the judge, the jury, everybody that he was insane. Now,
Nicholas Cruz from Parkland school shooting did the same thing if you watch his interrogation
yeah.
video.
Well, and the thing about it is there's a difference between being crazy and being insane.
Yeah.
So, and I know in Texas, the insanity defense is a very, very high bar to reach. And I would imagine it is in Idaho as well. So I think there's going to be, because this was a planned event. This wasn't something that spontaneously occurred. And he can act crazy and do all these things and sing you know, profane lyrics and rap songs and threaten people and say crazy things and do crazy things in that jail cell, I don't think that's going to help him much with his defense.
I had a working theory that he actually wanted to get caught because he wanted to work himself out of it. I know that that might be a weird theory, but I'm I was like, "Oh, maybe there's a chance." But the only reason why I don't think that that's true, because I heard another report that said when you're stabbing that many people that many times, you're gonna miss and eventually get your hand or get some part of you. And I didn't realize that that's like basically 100% of the time that that happens.
It does, and we just talked about that. Yeah, I mean, I've had cases myself where that has happened. So I think that there are some of these he may have planned.
Yeah.
He may have planned well.
Yeah.
Um, but maybe, we had a saying in the Marines that proper prior preparation prevents piss poor performance.
Mhm.
And I think he may have missed a little bit in the preparation. And maybe he didn't read up on the way people use edged weapons in these kind of circumstances. And that more times than not, they do inflict a wound on themselves, which then ends up resulting in their blood being mixed in or being in separate areas in the house. Because what we don't know is, was there a separate drop of blood somewhere?
Yeah.
Or I've had that at a scene where we just had this drop of blood that did no explanation about how it got there necessarily.
It's good.
It's surrounded by a whole bunch of blood,
Yeah.
and that turns out to be the one drop that actually came from the suspect.
I had saw a report that said they think that they got some DNA from a bathroom, that the killer had accidentally cut himself, went in the bathroom and tried to clean up a little bit. I don't know if that's true or not. That obviously is unconfirmed, but some of where I was hearing these sources from, 2, 3 days later, they hit the news cycle. So I wouldn't be surprised if you're hearing that hit the news cycle.
Well, I can tell you that happens a lot as well. They want to go in there and try to clean up when they realize what has happened.
Yeah.
And there, in fact, we don't know what that scene looks like, but there may be some places in there where it looks like blood has been tried to be cleaned up, that kind of thing. The problem is with that, with trying to do that, is they can go in there if the blood is even if it's washed away, in terms of the being able to view it. They can go in there. They used to use luminol. We used substance called we use luminol, but we use a substance called Bright Star. There may be some other substances out there where you can go in there and you can illuminate. You can see where the blood was, and you can, once you've identified those places, DNA swabs can be taken from those images.
What are some of the unanswered questions in this case?
Well, the big one is why.
The motive.
Why? And that's always the question in a homicide investigation. I know all the people that I put in the interview room, that was ultimately what I wanted to find out is why.
Yeah.
And that's always the question. Now, the who, what, where, when, how, and all that, those have all been answered, and they're gonna continue to build that evidence that answers those questions further. But in terms of it's the why, which would lead to the sub questions, which is where did he meet these folks, if he did?
Right.
What kind of a relationship did he have with them? And can we determine what happened that set him off? Was
Yeah.
this something that he has been thinking about doing to someone, and by some strange quirk here, they became the targets that he decided that, well, now here I have the people that I want to try this. I want to do this thing.
Hmm.
They have made themselves the targets for me, or target.
The motive, the big question, some of all of those sub questions underneath. Really good. I'm curious, and I know you don't maybe like hypothesizing as much maybe as I do, but the breakdown of what you thought took place. My thought in the beginning, because of the report from Brian Ensign that Kaylee Gonsalves suffered the worst injuries, was that she was the target And my thought was that he wasn't in the house waiting. He came in after they had already been in bed. He went up the stairs to the third floor. I think he knew that she lived on the third floor. Went in her room. She wasn't there. Went into the other room where Maddie's room is. Kaylee got significant injuries. Maddie was sort of crime of opportunity or happened to be there. I think Ethan heard what happened and so went out in the kitchen. There was some blood in the kitchen. I don't know if you saw a picture of that. And then as the killer comes down the stairs, confronts Ethan maybe in the kitchen, they get in an altercation. And then Xana is obviously awake in bed. He goes in the bedroom and kills Xana. And Ethan and Xana have defensive wounds. So a lot of that's sort of rooted in the facts of what has came out. Did you have a theory like that of what you thought or like, potential outcome of what took place?
No, I mean, I've already kind of shared here about what I think the route may have been, but again, they're going to. I don't like to be given to speculation. I'm just basing it on what little I know about the scene, but I think that, well, I know that they should be able to determine the path, where he entered, who he went to first, because if we've got um, if we've got certain elements on that second floor where Ethan and Xana are that may indicate that that's where he went first and then he went upstairs. I think we don't know if we've got footprints in blood
Good.
going upstairs or downstairs. I mean, we just don't know. And I would have to believe that there are going to be some indications about the route that was taken by this suspect to do what he did.
We had some questions coming in from viewers. If you have a couple more minutes, I'd love to
Sure.
ask you them. Laura 4x4 Explorer says, did you see the Reddit where they think that BK said what happened and inserted himself into the online chats and forums there?
I have not seen those Reddit uh, messages. The only thing that I am aware of in terms of the Reddit stuff was his apparently trying to recruit some folks in to take part in this study that he was taking
Yeah.
part in, or supposedly working on his PhD. Want to know if you're a criminal, if you've committed a crime, how did you feel before you did it? How did you feel after you did it? How did you feel when you were doing it? And that kind of thing. Now, I have seen that documentation, and I think that's interesting. And if not for what he did, those would be those would be innocent inquiries into a
Yeah.
person who's working on the PhD. So,
Yeah.
in and of themselves in isolation, not a big deal. But now that we know that he's the one that's been arrested for this and he is posting these kinds of things. But in regards to those particular Reddit posts, I haven't seen them. So I kind of hesitate to comment about that stuff.
I think the intent maybe behind the question would be, in your experience, is it common for a killer to engage with either online mediums or other mediums where there's active conversations going on about the crime?
Oh yeah, I don't think that's a big mystery. And in fact, I've had, we solved we solved the homicide in Houston because these people were, what was the old
The
system?
MySpace?
Snapchat. What was that? Isn't that the
Yeah.
one where you could video something and then you could take it off pretty
Yeah.
quick?
Yeah.
And it was kind of the precursor to TikTok, I think. But yeah, this guy was in the process of killing a guy, and the other person was sitting there with a Snapchat with his phone, taking the Snapchat video. And we got a hold of the video, and we're able to develop a witness out of it because the person with the Snapchat thing wasn't taking part in the killing,
Hmm.
but and that wasn't them necessarily taking part in the video itself. But we have had cases where we have the suspect who is engaging in social media in general discussions about things. Yeah, that's not terribly uncommon.
I thought it was a great question. Just there's another online report going around that he supposedly called into a YouTube show like a couple weeks ago. Do you think that Is there any chance that that would have taken place?
Well, there's always a chance. Um, I mean, there's always that possibility, and I guess if you got to wonder a lot of this. What I wonder about him
Hmm.
was his cell phone use,
Yeah.
and because look, they're going to be able to the cell phone stuff once they do the dumps on the tracking and so forth and so on. At least, and remember too, when that's and I used to use it all the time, and still do to a degree. But when that tracking stuff comes in with cell phones, remember it's tracking the phone.
Right.
It doesn't necessarily mean that the person who
Has the
owns the
phone.
phone is the one who is using the phone.
That's
So
right.
uh, most times that's the case. But I would think that what leads me to believe that they had all that stuff spot on, which is all part of that investigation, was to see if they can get that guy's number, get that phone tracked on where it was on that night at that time, unless he was smart enough to turn it off, that kind of thing. But then you're going to see a footprint there between, let's just say, for the sake of our discussion, that he is in uh, Pullman, Washington, sitting in his apartment, and he's about to go do this thing,
Hmm.
and he turns off his phone.
Yeah.
And then he goes and he finds whatever he needs to find, and he follows and he goes and he does what he does, and he goes back to his apartment and or leaves the area and starts immediately heading to Pennsylvania. Uh, and then we have a certain gap in time there where all of a sudden that phone comes back to life.
Yeah.
So, by inference, and this would be circumstantial evidence, what occurred in that gap of time?
Hmm.
And why did this phone get turned off 2 hours before the event? And why did it get turned on 2 hours afterwards?
Yeah.
So, um,
My thought was if he was a perfect criminal, he would leave his. Oh, I don't know what happened. It went down for a second, but we're
yeah, I lost you there.
my thought of what happened possibly was if he was like the trying to become the perfect criminal would be that he would leave his phone playing YouTube or Spotify or something in his apartment.
I mean, who knows? I
Yeah.
mean, he's if he thought that, I'm just this the I guess the suggestion he was trying to commit the perfect crime. I just see so many mistakes here
Yeah.
that again maybe he outsmarted himself.
Yeah. I mean, that's probably most likely what took place.
Yeah,
Somebody else I got to know is their name was saying that they heard that he and his dad got pulled over. His dad flew, I guess, to Washington and they made the trek back from Washington to Pennsylvania. They actually got pulled over a couple of times. Did you hear that?
I have not heard that. That's the first time I've heard that, and I'm kind of one of these guys that uh, I would hear a lot of things,
Yeah.
and I would have family members call me, and so and so told me this and that, and blah blah blah, or you'd have a witness. Always interviewing a witness, you're telling them, I need to know what you know. I need to know what you saw. I don't need you to tell me what somebody else told you,
Right.
unless it's the suspect making an admission to you. So these things now that are coming out, unless they're verified by law enforcement, I don't. I look at them as just a point of interest, but I would never say that. Yeah, that's happened.
Well, I mean, that makes sense. What there was some interesting information on his Carfax report that it was dinged on November 18th, 2022, which was an issue that had to be updated with the Washington Motor Vehicle Department. And I thought, I wonder if that was some sort of like sleuthy technique to try to get a locale on the car or something. And then the same thing sort of happened on December 1st. The manufacturer sort of dinged the car, and these things were showing up on the Carfax report for his specific vehicle. That information was available because his car registration came available, which, by the way, was a 2015 white Hyundai Elantra, not a 2011 to 2013 white Hyundai Elantra. So I don't know how that information ended up on the Carfax report, or even maybe what the significance of it is, but those things were on there.
Where was the car registered? In Washington State or in Pennsylvania? Do we know?
Yeah, I have that pulled up. Let me just see for 1 second. It was registered initially in Pennsylvania, and then the registration shifted uh, to it being registered in Washington.
Okay. So I can tell you, having worked a case in terms of the vehicle stuff similar to this, where I had to find a what turned out to be a Toyota 4Runner. We had a video at a McDonald's of this suspect vehicle pulling out of the in the drive-through in the drive-through area from the drive-through area, and we had this snapshot, of course, from the inside, and there was a screen hanging there and whatever. But we had this image. We had this white vehicle, and I went down to CarMax and had them line up for, and we believed it to be a rental, and had them line up 4 different similar-looking SUVs, and we determined that the taillights on the one in our image was the 2015 model Toyota 4Runner. So we were able to determine that's what it was. And I went to every rental agency company in the city of
Wow.
Houston and requested that they provide me every white 4Runner 2015 or 2016 model that they had rented out. Now, it turns out that our suspect ultimately was a clever guy, and he was actually ended up being killed in a police shootout because he was a bank robber and an armored car robber, and he was killing armored car personnel. But we were able to track it down. He sent somebody in, send in a one of his little cohorts, a female, to go in and rent a vehicle. They would come out, they would put a tracker on the vehicle, and then they would turn it in. And then when it got rented out again, he would go find the car, steal the car, replace the plates, and then put the car in a place where he could keep it, where nobody would even notice it. And then he would use it. He set up a sniper's nest in the trunk, and he would use it repeatedly, and nobody could find the thing. So,
Wow.
but tracking all that stuff down, I think they put out 22,000 Elantras. Now I don't know if that was white Elantras. I mean, I don't know. But I would imagine that they were using a similar process because they knew what kind of car it was, and crossing those borders
Yeah.
that close, I would imagine that they were able to pare it down to a specific vehicle. So,
Yeah. Wow. Well, I really appreciate your expertise and insight on this. What are some things that we haven't talked about today that you think were really important?
well, I tell you what, I've said it kind of at the opening of this thing, but what I think is important is that, and what people need to understand is that from the beginning, and this is what I tried to convey to everybody from the beginning, was these law enforcement officers in Moscow, Idaho, the chief, the state detectives they brought in, the special agents they brought in from the FBI, and utilizing all those support personnel from all of those
Mhm.
agencies. This was a collective effort to
Yeah.
bring this evildoer to justice.
Yeah.
And I give, there's no amount of kudos that I can give to the chief for his leadership in this thing. And he stayed the course, even with all the slings and arrows that were being thrown at him.
Yeah.
So I think it's important for people to realize that we're still the good guys. I'm talking about law enforcement. We're still the good guys. And we're going to go out there, and it doesn't make any difference what the race, creed, color,
Yeah.
orientation, cultural background, religious background, what flavor they may be. when you have a homicide, especially when you have one of this magnitude, let me tell you what, it is all the forces that can be marshaled to get to the right person who did the wrong thing, serve some justice, and bring about some peace for those families. And I think I cannot emphasize that enough in this case.
Yeah.
And I think that those folks that have bashed that chief, bashed that department, bashed those detectives, and calling for people's heads on platters, I think they owe that department, all of the detectives, all of the
Mhm.
special agents involved in that investigation, a huge apology.
I agree.
So that's what I would emphasize at the end of our end of our very comprehensive conversation here,
Well,
Todd.
as you were saying that, I thought of another question that I wanted to ask you because I was watching some other channel talk about this, and actually, it was an expert, like a professor who studies the psychology
Well,
of
there's a bunch of them out there.
serial killer. I know there's a lot out there, but one of the things that they said was, well, they said I hate to use the word evil because that has a religious connotation attached to it. And I actually work for a psychiatrist, and I asked him the question sometime because v- very high level psychiatrist, board certified, and is operating with a very unique type of practice with a year long or more wait list to be able to come see him. And so when I first started working for him, and my background's in ministry, and pretty much my whole worldview is a Christian perspective, a biblical perspective, definitely not a personal perspective, which is the difference. It's like, do you want a biblical perspective, which means the Bible informs our views, or a personal perspective, which means my emotions decide the way I think? And I've chosen the Bible personally. I'm not saying if you're watching, you have to, but I've chosen the Bible to be my viewpoint. But I asked him the question, the psychiatrist, if he thinks these things that happen inside of people are demonic or spiritual. I'm genuinely curious what he thought. Or was it a genetic disposition? And he's like, it's both. There's sometimes where it's deeply genetics. There's DNA we can trace. There's even formation and shape of the brain that we can analyze that could lead to narcissism at times, even environmental stuff or psychopathy you know, but sometimes there's some demonic spiritual thresholds people have opened themselves up to, and then it's sort of ushered in this wicked side of them. Do you think evil's an appropriate word?
I think it is most appropriate, and I would tell you this: I've made those types of comments, and I've been a couple people that have said, "Well, here he goes, he's introduced religion." Well, let me tell you, for all those people need to understand that. Look, I've looked into the face of evil.
Yeah.
I've looked into the face of a person who, for the lack of a better term, was a good person, but who committed a bad act.
Right.
And I have looked into the face of an evil person who's committed an evil act and will continue to do that because that's the nature of who they have decided. That's the choice that they've made.
Yeah.
Life is nothing but a series of choices.
Yeah.
And I can tell you that I can sum up what we're talking about here in one word, and that word is sin.
Yeah.
And there is, and I'm not talking about religion, because what
Mhm.
is religion? Religion is man's attempt to
Right.
communicate with God. And who was Jesus Christ? That was God's message and savior to us to communicate with us.
Hmm.
So, and whether people believe that or not is not the issue,
Right.
because God gave us a freedom of choice. And ever since the fall in the Garden of Eden, and ever since Cain killed Abel, there has been sin in the world. We're
Right.
all born into it. And that means all. And Jesus Christ died for all of
For
us.
all. Yeah.
That means believers and non believers. He died for all of us, and all means all. That's all means. So when I hear people try to, you don't use the word evil because that's religious, don't do this and that. To me, I think that's a person that doesn't, they live in a world that is they're living in a world of darkness. I'll just put it
Right.
that way. Look, John 1:5 says that the light shines into the darkness and the darkness did not comprehend it.
Yeah.
I can tell you, I have walked into, I don't know how many countless interview rooms knowing that I was walking into darkness and that it was my responsibility to bring the light into that darkness because darkness doesn't exist on its own.
Yeah.
How does darkness even, how is it even available? How is it even there? It's the
Yeah.
absence of light.
Yeah.
So and I don't mean to get on a soapbox or preachy here, but I just think people need to understand that, look, the world has been painted in so many shades of gray, and that's not the real world.
It's
The
true.
real world is black and white. The real world is good and evil. There is a heaven and a hell, and there is just as much as there is a devil in hell, there is a savior in heaven.
That's right.
So, and I'll tell you, and that's not a theological discussion. That is the truth,
Hmm.
and and that's truth with a capital T. And I will tell you that the truth is designed to make people feel uncomfortable.
That's right.
So when I hear people make a comment about you're getting too religious and this and that, I just tell myself that all I'm doing is speaking the truth,
Hmm.
and you're
Hmm.
uncomfortable with it.
Yeah.
That's that's not my problem. That's your problem. I cannot make I can explain it to you, but I can't make you understand it for you.
Right.
Right?
That's what one thing I never even thought about was using any other word to describe what happened in this horrible instance in Moscow, Idaho, other than evil. I can't think of another way to describe it. It's horrific, it's evil, and there's nothing attached to it that is good.
No, no, no.
So,
There's nothing. You're not going to find, an act of evil. You're not going to find something good that comes out of that act. Now, there may be some things that uh, compassion for those families. There may be
right.
some things that are good and wholesome that are going to hopefully lift those families up and give them some peace and some support. And I don't know where they are in their walk, but I'm hoping and praying. I pray for those folks every day.
Yeah.
I have prayed with people in their living rooms whose child or whose husband or whose mother or father or wife, sister, brother, good friend who have been taken from them by an act of evil. So, uh, people, all I can tell you, especially in today's world, um, you better start looking up because he's coming back.
Debbie Campbell sends a question through a super chat and says, "What information should we expect from the courts to be released when he returns?" Thank you, Phil Waters, for coming on tonight. May God bless you and your family.
Well, thank you. Um, Once they start getting into the process, now he has waived extradition, which is a good thing. I mean, in terms of time. So he's going to be sent back to Idaho. And then once the process starts, once he's arraigned there and so forth and so on, and then the system of justice will start to move. And I'm going to tell you, it's going to move slowly. Now they may, because these prosecutors are not going to try to rush this thing and make some sort of tactical error or
Yeah.
make some strategical mistake. Um, so once we start seeing filings,
Yeah.
there's going to be a lot revealed when we see the affidavit,
Right.
but it's not going to be everything. And then once this process starts to go through to get us to the trial, there are going to be a lot of motions made from both sides. He's the first thing that's going to have to happen to him. He's going to have to get an attorney,
Yeah.
and whether that's court appointed or whether I would imagine court appointed, I don't know. I don't know what kind of resources his family has, but you'll see the process start to work, and then we're going to get to the trial, possibly there's always the possibility that he may seek a plea in trade for something. So I think we all just have to stand by and let's see how it ultimately unfolds. But what I'm hoping and praying for is that we get that question answered about the why for
Oh,
the sake of the families.
well, Phil Waters, thank you so much for coming on, and I hope you'll be back to join us again in the
Sure.
coming couple days or weeks as we continue to unpack this case. Thank you so much. What a breath of fresh air to have someone from a Christian perspective be able to share your thoughts with us. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Tyler, and God bless y'all, and Happy New Year.
Yeah, Happy New Year. God bless you. Well, what an amazing guest that we have. Coming up, we have Dr. Lisa